Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're playing Dimir Land Destruction 4 Net Benefits, the series where we explore the benefits of net decking in Pauper. I will be the first one to tell you how much fun it is to play a land destruction deck in the Pauper format, and after I got my butt whooped by this Dimir version of it last week, I had to take it out for a spin myself. I've got to give it to Hrimfax, who took this deck to a 5-0 finish in a Magic the Gathering Online Pauper League last week. They managed to turn all of the power of mono black land destruction into a consistent machine with things like Ponder, Preordain, and Augur of Bolas. I'm going to start breaking down this deck by talking about those black land destruction spells. It starts with Choking Sands, which costs 1 black for a sorcery that destroys target non-swamp land. If that land was non-basic, Choking Sands deals 2 damage to that land's controller. The 2 damage might not seem very relevant here, but the deck plays glacially slowly. We're going to be trying to peck in for damage with Augur of Bolas and Thorn of the Black Rose, so buffering our opponent's life total downwards is really important, even as we're destroying their lands and trying to lock them out of the game. We're also running the full 4 copies of Rancid Earth. It costs 1 black and destroys target land, but if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, instead you destroy that land and Rancid Earth deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. Unlike the mono black version of this deck that had a bit of anti-synergy with Rancid Earth and Dusk Legion Zealot, this deck runs Augur of Bolas instead, so the Rancid Earth will sweep away all of your opponent's X1s while leaving you with a board to continue your attack. Our last 3 mana black land destruction spell is Icequake. It costs 1 black, it destroys target land, and if that land was a snow land, Icequake deals 1 damage to that land's controller. We'd probably still be happy if this was another 4 copies of Choking Sands. Dealing that extra point of damage is really important. However, there are a lot of decks that play snowlands just to be fancy in this format, so Icequake is often going to deal that extra point of damage to our opponent. Our last 3 mana land disruption spell is Recoil. It costs 1 blue and it returns target permanent to its owner's hand. Then that player discards a card. In the games I played with mono black land destruction, I don't know that I was ever really choked for a cheap land destruction spell when I needed it. However, using this over more copies of Befoul lets us deal with more types of creatures and controls the amount of cards our opponent has in hand. Speaking of Befoul, we are still running 1 copy, and I'm happy to see it here. Befoul costs 2 black and destroys target land or non-black creature. It can't be regenerated. One of the things that happens with land destruction decks is that they often can't beat a resolved aggressive threat. That's why it's awesome to have a copy of Befoul so that we can just reach out and kill that creature while we keep our opponent off of their lands. I'm going to talk about our interaction next. This is the way we deal with that awkward board state where our opponent does manage to get a few creatures down and attack us with them while we're searching for our land destruction spells to make sure they don't have enough mana to cast anymore. First is Fade Away, which I'm way more used to seeing in blue sideboards as a sort of pseudo wrath effect. Fade Away costs 2 and a blue for sorcery, and it says, for each creature its controller sacrifices a permanent unless they pay 1. Having Fade Away in a land destruction deck goes a long way to breaking the synergy of this card. We'll often have more lands than our opponent, so we should be able to trap them into not being able to pay for all the creatures they have on board. That way, they either sacrifice the lands they have left or they sacrifice the creatures that are threatening our life total. The rest of our interaction comes in the form of a couple of Chainer's Edicts. This is going to be great if our opponent is boggling up a single threat or if they only manage to resolve one before we can destroy enough lands to keep them off more creatures. Chainer's Edict costs 1 and a black for a sorcery, and it causes target player to sacrifice a creature. You can also flash it back, which means you can pay 5 black, exile it, and cast it again from your graveyard. The rest of our deck is all about value and card filtering, starting with the creatures. First, we have Augur of Bolas, which costs 1 and a blue for a 1/3, and when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal an instant or sorcery card from among them, put it into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. I'm always more confident in a strategy if it has an Augur of Bolas in it. This card is one of the most powerful 2-for-1s in the Pauper format, mainly because sometimes it doubles as another copy of Ponder or Preordain. I'll get to those soon. Our last value creature is Thorn of the Black Rose. It costs 3 and a black for a 1/3 with Death Touch, which is almost fine on its own, but we haven't even gotten to the best part yet. When Thorn of the Black Rose enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. Becoming the Monarch means you draw an extra card at the beginning of each of your end steps. Then, if someone someone who isn't the monarch deals combat damage to you, they become the monarch and get to start drawing the extra cards. We have a ton of insurance against our opponent having a creature on board to attack us after we resolve a Thorn of the Black Rose. They won't even have any mana to cast one, so we can get the monarch ability and start steamrolling extra cards, getting more land destruction spells and more interaction before our opponent has a chance to react. Finally, we have our non-creature card filtering and some of the most powerful blue spells in the Pauper format. First, we have Ponder. It costs 1 blue mana, and it lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put them back in any order. You may shuffle your library, then you draw a card. This goes along especially well with our other blue card filtering spell, Preordain. It costs 1 blue that lets you scry 2, then draw a card. Maybe you scry away the cards you don't want off your Ponder and even get a fresh look at something new off the top of your deck. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base, starting with our last non-land card, Dark Ritual. I've included this in the mana base because that's pretty much what it is. It costs 1 black for an instant and adds 3 black mana. Dark Ritual can really enable a ton of broken looking turn 1s, but ideally we're looking to use this spell to destroy our opponent's first land drop with one of our 3-cost Choking Sands, Rancid Earths, or Ice Quakes. Alright, moving on to the actual lands in our mana base. It starts with Peat Bog, a staple in land destruction decks because it accelerates you to 3 mana on turn 2 if your opponent is on the draw. You can still blow up that first land drop. Peat Bog enters the battlefield tapped with 2 depletion counters on it. You can tap it and remove a depletion counter from it to add 2 black mana. If there's no depletion counters on Peat Bog, sacrifice it. Peat Bog is a little bit risky, especially if you keep a hand that only has something like Peat Bog and Dark Ritual in it. However, it's a little less risky in this build of the deck because we can recur it with Dimir Aqueducts, our blue-black Karus. Dimir Aqueduct enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land you control to your hand, and when it becomes untapped, it adds blue and black. This is going along with our Dismal Backwaters to fix our mana. These are just standard Pauper duels. They enter the battlefield tapped, gain you a life, and when they become untapped, they add blue and black. We're also running a single copy of Radiant Fountain, which is really sweet with Dimir Aqueducts. It gains you 2 life and only taps for a colorless, but if we can play this a few times off of our Dimir Aqueducts, it feels pretty good. Finally, our last non-basics are a couple copies of Ash Barrens. We're kind of not splashing, so this might be a little bit difficult to fix our mana with. However, we can get a little bit of extra black mana with Dark Ritual after casting something like a Chainer's Edict on turn 1, so the extra mana to cycle it away to fix our mana shouldn't be that bad. Finally, we're running 3 basic islands and 3 basic swamps. We're running just enough untapped basic mana so that we can sometimes cast a cantrip on turn 1 or sometimes cast a Dark Ritual on turn 1 and blow up our opponent's first land drop. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have 2 copies of Mana Leak, which is pretty cool and synergistic with our deck. They have to pay 3 mana or have their spell countered, and they often won't be able to do that because we've blown up all of those mana producing lands. We have 2 copies of Pestilence. It just hoses Delver decks, and it's good against decks with small butt creatures. We have 2 copies of Evankar's Justice if we have to deal 2 to a wide board, and we have a single copy of Nausea if our opponent is only on X1s. We have 2 copies of Radiant Fountain for buffering our life total against burn. This is another really cool inclusion. We have another copy of Fade Away if our opponent has a really wide board but doesn't use a lot of mana, something like Mono Green Stompy. We have 4 copies of Aura Flux for those Boggles decks because they won't have enough mana to pay for the auras on their creatures, and we have 1 copy of Serrated Arrows for making sure Tireless Tribe can't go inside out and kill us. And there it is, Dimir Land Destruction by Hrimfax. I'm going to take this deck into a league at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince. I'm there every Monday night at 7 p.m. Atlantic time playing competitive Pauper decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech, and hopefully I'll see you on Monday night.